Mr. Reimer has 25 years of experience working with Indigenous peoples, both at the community level and internationally. He represents and advises Inuit in United Nations, the Arctic Council, and other international fora. He has a degree in civil engineering and a master's in environmental studies, and currently Mr. Reimer spends much of his time acting as senior policy advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council. Mr. Reimer?
Thank you, Professor Fortier. As you can see, Dwayne Smith's name is on the first slide. I'm not Dwayne Smith, as Professor Fortier said. Now, somebody said if you're subbing in for Dwayne, all you have to do is lean back and look at the audience, cross your arms, and scowl. I'm not quite sure who said that. No, I work with Dwayne quite a bit, so I think he'll be happy with that. Dwayne will be happy to know as well that the other Professor Fortier said that they don't really care what they're doing, the scientists, that is, those among you, and you'll all be dead soon. But no. To be honest, Dwayne has told me often how far he thinks science and Indigenous peoples have come in talking to each other and working together, and he's mentioned both Professor Fortier's names often in that regard, and he's very happy to have been working with you. Many of you know him working on ArcticNet projects and other things. I'd like to thank the organizing committee for letting me drop in like this, and thank you for the support staff too, who've been very helpful. Dwayne is an Inuk who grew up near Inuvik on the shores of the Beaufort Sea, and has worked with conservation and wildlife most of his life. He is someone who regularly participates in traditional Inuit hunting out on the sea ice, and this topic of Arctic change is very dear to his heart. This subject is also vitally important for all Inuit, and I hope I can convey to you some of Dwayne's thoughts and some of the interests of the Inuit Circumpolar Council, or ICC. I want to draw your attention to the title of this presentation. The sea ice is our highway. This refers to Inuit using the ice and water and coastal zone of the Arctic Ocean, in some ways similar to those here in Miami who use freeways and highways in this part of the world. It also refers to a study that ICC Canada undertook on how Inuit use sea ice today. The name implies movement, lots of movement. Inuit use the sea ice for transportation, and the name also conjures up images of places one goes to search for food. Rather than finding supermarkets, Inuit find animals, marine mammals, birds, and the like. And the other Professor Fortier mentioned that today in his presentation earlier. Like the superhighways around here, the Arctic sea ice and Arctic waters are becoming busier, some would say crowded, with interest from the outside, from non-Inuit, from researchers, from Arctic states, non-Arctic states, and tourists. China wants to become part of the Arctic Council as a permanent observer, for example. The European Union as well. They have much to offer, and Inuit are interested in exploring mutually beneficial goals. But Inuit are also reticent to see the Arctic highway become too busy. I'll discuss this reticence a bit later. Again, Professor Fortier, I think, mentioned fisheries becoming like a fisheries Klondike, and he mentioned other things that we should be aware of. Now, still looking at the screen, the next part of the subtitle is The Human Dimension of Arctic Change. And it's a reminder that change is happening, that some of it is impacting greatly on humans, and much of it is also affected by and caused by humans. And with this change comes adaptation. The Inuit highway is changing, and I'd like to explore a few examples of what that all means. Much change was coming to the Arctic in the early 1970s as well. Much of it was due to the energy crisis of the time, and oil companies moved into the North Slope of Alaska and without consulting with the Inuit or the Inupiaq living there. And resistance ensued back then, but then negotiations and eventually compromise, And the Alaskan North Slope Borough's mayor at the time, Eben Hobson, led much of this resistance, but also the negotiations and compromise. What he saw happening to the environment then, and also the change happening then, made him, encouraged him to invite Inuit from other places across the Arctic, from Chukotka, Greenland, Canada, and Alaska, to come to Barrow to talk about some of this change, some of the environmental impacts, but also on what the political change was happening to them, who was making decisions about what was happening to them. And although the Russian Inuit at that time couldn't come because of the Cold War, they established the Inuit Circumpolar Council at that time in 1977. As you can see from the slide, Inuit are a coastal people. And again, as Professor Louis Fortier mentioned, they live in an area that are directly affected by an area that 5 foreign ministers will discuss, once again without Inuit at the table, it seems, in 2 weeks' time. More of that later. Every 4 years, Inuit meet at ICC General Assemblies and set policy and plans for the ensuing 4 years. And we have among us former ICC President Caleb Pungawi, who presided over one of those assemblies and attended it often as a delegate and also as a council member. Because Inuit are a coastal and a marine people, one can see how important sea ice has been to them. Their identity and way of life is closely connected with the sea, the ice, and the snow of the Arctic. You can see this also by the location of Inuit communities. Like Dwayne Smith's home of Inuvik, virtually all Inuit communities are located on the coast or on major waterways with easy access to the sea. Historical data, including research led by Milton Freeman in the Inuit Land Use and Occupancy Project done in the 1970s, shows that sea ice has always been an extension of Inuit land. These were very important for the Inuit land claims process in Canada back then, and may well be in the political landscape of today's change. For those of you who don't know, that groundbreaking work and other similar land use and occupancy studies, it set the stage for a lot of the negotiations leading to the land claims regions in Canada today. But today there's Arctic sovereignty talks, Arctic governance, and all this is increasingly important. They're all increasingly important topics, and you know, these studies may, and similar studies may be important in that regard. In 2008, ICC Canada reviewed these historical studies, and headed by Dwayne Smith, one of the questions we did, or one of the steps we did was to interview about 20 or so hunters and elders to ask them about their use of sea ice today. Now, 20 isn't a big number, nothing compared to what Freeman did, but it gave us an interesting sort of account. We know they continue to eat traditional diets, meaning food that comes from subsistence hunting, fishing, whaling, birding, from berries, and so on. The individuals we interviewed told us they are having an increased difficulty finding and harvesting big game and sea mammals due to thinning sea ice and less predictable sea ice. But they are doing their best to maintain their traditional diet. This wasn't a climate change study, but as again Louis Fortier showed, the sea ice is shrinking. They told us that changes in ice conditions were affecting their traditional diets because they often have to travel further or in a different month than usual. Some of them said they are making dietary substitutions, such as hunting more musk oxen, if the caribou migration has shifted away from the area. Several of the hunters and elders also mentioned that melting permafrost has made the natural ice cellars used to age and store meat much less effective. But not one of the people we interviewed said they were ever giving up on hunting. They had a resolve. Now again, Professor Fortier's slides earlier on maybe are kind of daunting in this regard, but they had a resolve. They said they were not going to give up. They would change, they would adapt. For example, Frank Pokiak from the Hunters and Trappers Association in the Inuvialuit settlement region, where Dwayne comes from, said this: "The majority of the food I still get is from the land. I still depend on all the fish that we get and different ways to prepare it. Whale meat and seal meat, geese. Many other studies have also shown that Arctic indigenous peoples remain highly dependent on what is often called country food, and there are many health benefits. Life in the Arctic, lives of people, but also lives of wildlife, birds, fish, sea mammals, and so on, is dependent on movement, as I mentioned earlier. Many of the species in the Arctic are highly migratory. They travel huge distances on their annual migrations, and much of this depends on sea ice. When ice conditions change, it changes their migratory patterns. In some cases, it prevents them from accessing their usual feeding or nesting areas. Because Inuit rely on these highly migratory species for their subsistence, their way of life requires a great deal of movement. They follow the animals as far as needed in each season, depending on the conditions of that particular year. Though many Inuit are increasingly using snowmobiles instead of dog teams, although in Greenland you see significant dog teams and elsewhere as well, they are still out in the land and sea, just as their ancestors were. The hunters we interviewed said that in some cases they do not need to travel as far as they did years ago in order to find enough game, but others said they must travel much further than they used to. On the average, we think that Inuit are still occupying a similar amount of land and sea as they did in the past generations. Incidentally, the report on this mini update or mini study is available. Maybe James Kuptanek, you can wave. You have a few of these booklets that he has with him. If you'd like a copy, I'm sure he'd be happy to share it with you. Based on the fact that Inuit continue to rely on traditional foods and continue to practice subsistent hunting in the harvesting in the same regions that they have used and occupied for almost forever, and because the sea ice is a vital highway, ICC would like to present 3 recommendations for those involved in Arctic matters to consider. Recommendation 1 is that Arctic shipping, which is rapidly increasing in volume and is predicted to grow more and more as sea ice melts, must be strictly and effectively regulated. We all know that oil and gas is a large industry in the Arctic, and further exploration is rapidly moving forward as shown on this map. Given the opening of the Arctic sea routes and projected growth in ship traffic, Inuit health and the health of the Arctic system depends on strict regulations to protect the water, the land, and the air from pollution these ships bring with them. Related specifically to Inuit use of the land, you can see on this map of the area around Kugluktuk and Nunavut that one of the routes that make up the Northwest Passage goes directly through a region where Inuit harvest numerous species of sea mammals and other wildlife. The map is from the Inuit Land Use and Occupancies Project, but this route we've added that for effect. In fact, all the routes that make up the Northwest Passage go through Inuit hunting regions. On this map, the red dots are Inuit communities, which are all located on the coast, and or they're located on the coast or near the coast, as I said earlier. The blue line shows various routes that make up the polar routes. Clearly, there's a great risk here, especially if there's an oil spill, but even small amounts of pollution can have a very negative effect. It will also be necessary to regulate when and where ships are allowed to travel. There's particularly sensitive areas where animals feed and nest and so on. It is important to note that disruption of migration cycles is a concern that applies to scientific research vessels and military patrols, not only to commercial vessels. Several Arctic states are also increasing their military patrols in the Arctic, and we also know that China and others are increasing their research and so on, as I mentioned. The second recommendation comes directly out of ICC Canada's interviews with Inuit hunters, is that we need to gain more support for Inuit adaptation. This conference here is all about the changes that are occurring in the Arctic and predictions about how the Arctic will continue to change in the future. Because Inuit are part of the Arctic ecosystem, all of the changes to this ecosystem affect Inuit. Many Inuit communities are under serious threat from coastal erosion. This has now become a problem because of receding sea ice and longer ice-free periods and so on. When larger storms come, they seem to be coming more frequently as well. There's less ice around to protect the coastline from erosion. Permafrost is melting. Many villages may have to be relocated, as you've probably heard before. It should be emphasized that Inuit are creative and courageous in this time of change, and they are determined to adapt just as their ancestors have adapted for millennia. You can see this in the quotes from some of the hunters ICC Canada interviewed for the Sea Ice is our highway study. When asked how his life might change because of poor ice conditions in the future, an elder from Pungartung, Nunavut said, "Then we'll use other equipment. People will still hunt. It's part of our life. When things change, you just have to go with it." The sentiment was echoed by a hunter from Tuktoyaktuk, who said, "I'm still going to depend on harvesting. Different species if it has to be. You just change with the changes, I guess. As long as I'm alive, I'll keep doing what I'm doing." After describing in detail how climate change is forcing his community to deal with new challenges, an elder from Sax Harbor shared this idea on how he can continue his harvesting practices. "A buddy of mine is into making little sleds," he said, of aluminum, which you can use as a little kayak or boat. If you're out on the ice and you have to cross an open lead or something, you can use that. I'm going to get one of those. It's combined as a little sleigh, and if you have to, you can use it as a boat. That's one way I can adapt. And a final recommendation is a reminder to always remember the human dimension of the Arctic. While it may seem the Arctic is a peopleless tundra to many, as you here know, this is not the case. While there are only 160,000 or so Inuit in Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and the Chukotka Peninsula in Russia, they cover a lot of ground. And the animals they rely on for subsistence still cover even more ground, and everything they encounter on their migratory travels affects their health, as I've mentioned. The main point of this presentation today is that Inuit are affected by everything that happens in their homeland, the Arctic. And they believe it is their right to be consulted on all matters that affect them. In May 2008, the foreign ministers of the so-called Ocean's 5 nations took place in Ilulissat, Greenland. At that meeting, foreign ministers of the 5 countries that border on the Arctic Ocean met to discuss questions such as who owns the Arctic and how can we resolve the disputes we may have among us regarding the Arctic Ocean. Except for a statement that ICC Greenland president was to be made, Inuit, in terms of at least the decision-making over the Ilulissat Declaration, were shut out of that important discussion. Now, Greenland, or Denmark did have Greenlanders, Greenland Inuit on the delegation, but ICC and Inuit as a whole had no input. This is why in April 2009, or at least in part, why Inuit launched a Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Sovereignty in the Arctic. In this declaration, Inuit asserted their rights as indigenous peoples of the Arctic and stated their commitment to working with Arctic states and others to build partnerships in which the rights, roles, and responsibilities of Inuit are fully recognized and accommodated. The Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs supported the collaborative nature of the declaration at the last Arctic Council Foreign Ministers meeting in Norway. This is the 8-nation Arctic Council. In fact, he praised the inclusion at the Arctic Council table of indigenous peoples organizations and said that the Arctic's indigenous peoples should also have a direct say in Arctic forums beyond the 8-nation Arctic Council. James Kapchana, again over here, has several copies of the Circumpolar Inuit Declaration on Sovereignty in the Arctic and would be happy to give you one if you ask him. James, by the way, is working with the Inuit Circumpolar Council as well. Well, it appears at this the same ministers in hosting, or this same ministers in hosting these similar 5-nation summit in a couple of weeks, that maybe the same thing is going to be happening. These countries will be discussing matters of great concern to Inuit, and as Louis Fortier mentioned, and some of these maps show, Inuit rely on the Arctic, and this is sort of a smaller area than the Arctic Council covers, and Inuit are directly, and still especially Inuit, are affected by these talks. As of now, no invitation has been forthcoming. This lack of inclusion is also a change that involves not only the political, but also the human dimension. In conclusion, ICC would propose the following actions be undertaken as next steps by those who are involved in the Arctic. Recognition that marine resources are a common resource, and that Inuit are part of that equation. Commitment to develop a coordinated approach to better understand Arctic ecosystems. Development of stringent regulations that adopt a precautionary approach. Prioritization of sustainability and subsistence use. Clearly, there is much work to be done in the struggle for Inuit to be equal partners in their Arctic home. This is why Dwayne Smith and other Inuit leaders continue to emphasize at every opportunity that there is a human dimension to the Arctic. It is their highway, it is their home. Thank you.